This is Duke University.
All right, good morning. My name is Johnny Fu. I'm a second-year MBA student here at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Duke University Energy Conference, to Duke University, and to Fuqua. Today's event is the culmination of many months of hard work between many student clubs and organizations here at Duke University, and it should be a fantastic event for all of our attendees and our great speakers. And with that, I'd like to have everybody join me in welcoming Dr. Rich Broadhead, President of Duke University.
Well, thank you very much, and I too welcome you all to Duke and to the Energy Conference. I was pleased to be asked to say a word at this conference. It is the fate of the president never to attend a conference that he opens, but that's okay. This is a very meaningful event to me, and so I wanted to come and connect with it as best I could. And thinking about its subject, I had the thought, remember the day you learned in Greek mythology the story of Prometheus, the person who stole fire from the gods and gave it to men. And you know that in Greek mythology, that's the story of the origin of civilization. But I suppose it was only as I was thinking about this conference that it occurred to me that in that story, the origin of civilization lies in the mastery and control of energy sources. And when you stop and think of it that way, we do know that the entire growth of what we call civilization, that distinctive form of human society, has to do with the distinctively human ability to control and exploit energy sources. I was interested to look, I don't pretend this is a scientific statement, but my quick search on the web discovered that the human population increased fourfold between 1900 and 2000, but that human energy use increased something like 15 or 16-fold during that period of time. So we think of all those marches, everything we do, we all sit around priding ourselves on sustainability while using all the new devices that themselves use all different forms of energy. And there we are, and we also know that as rising tide throughout the world in recent years has lifted more and more people to the point where they can enjoy some of the benefits of advanced civilization, they instantly become energy users, and so it is that demand has grown and grown. So that's one part of the story, and no doubt the reason we have a conference today is because everyone knows that energy has become not a secondary need of the human species, but a primary need. It really is as primary to everything humans do as the need for food and shelter and other elemental needs of life. But our primary need for energy locks us into the embrace of all kinds of difficulties, which you well know. No one now knows an infinite source of energy, so where will the sources come from? What will they cost? What will be the sustainable economic model? Everyone knows the consequences that energy use has had for our climate and for our environment, so that in pursuit of one elemental need, you end up putting other things you need in jeopardy. I think we have all felt ourselves fairly fortunate not yet to live through a major international cataclysm of geopolitical conflict over energy sources, but I think if you want to think about conflicts in the future, that's always been one of the easiest scenarios to imagine. So you got to figure, this is a security issue, it's a health issue, it's a climate issue, it's an economic well-being issue. It is a most fundamental kind of issues. I presume you are here today because you believe that solving or at least achieving better rather than worse outcomes in our energy future is not beyond the wit of man. But one thing we do know is it will be beyond the wit of any single man or woman to do this. This is the nature of this problem, is that it's lots of different problems simultaneously. At Duke, we have made our energy initiative one of the signature initiatives for the university going forward, on the understanding that dealing creatively with this subject will be the work of our engineers, of our law students, of our policy students, of students in economics, of students in the business school, students all over the place working together. And when I looked at the list of people coming to this conference, you see the same idea. There are people from government here, Because how could you ever solve the problem without governmental actors? There are people from the corporate sector, because how could you ever solve it without action from that sector? There are people from the not-for-profit sector. How could you ever solve it without that? But we know it's the nature of this problem that no one set of actors alone is going to be able to do very much. And so it is the cooperation, in the most literal sense, the working together of groups of people that lays the basis for any kind of hope. I would just like to offer my gratitude to those of you who have left your jobs and traveled to Duke today to speak at this conference. I offer my thanks to every speaker, but certainly to Jim Rogers and Kateri Callahan as our keynote speakers. But I would also like to offer, and I hope those of you who traveled from afar don't think this is too self-serving of me, I would like to offer my special thanks to the Duke students who dreamed up this event. Now, you know that the Fuqua School of Business MBA students have had an energy club, and it has had a conference. But the fun of today's conference is they didn't only want to have a conference with themselves. They wanted to confer with all the other clubs across the university, all the other organizations of students, you know, and I suppose every one of us of a certain age, when you speak before a student audience, you always know it's worthwhile because you know somebody in that audience is going to be the smart person who goes on to make some important move in one of the sectors I've described. We are delighted to have you at Duke. I wish you a great day of conference. When you find the solution to today's issues, make sure to call my office right away. Again, I welcome you all to Duke. Thanks so much.
Greetings. My name is Tim Perfett. I'm the director of the Nicholas Institute. I first just want to pause and sort of appreciate the eloquence of our president. So how wonderful it is for him to come invoke this conference for us. It's also my really distinct pleasure to introduce to you today our first keynote speaker, Jim Rogers, the CEO of Duke Energy. Jim has been a friend, a colleague, and a board member of the Nicholas Institute since its founding. When I look at the title of this conference and looking at the future of industry, I want to make sure the audience here really appreciates what a distinct and unique pleasure it is to have Jim come speak to us on this topic. Jim is entering his 25th year as a CEO of a utility in America, and I don't think in those years any CEO has looked more to the future of energy than Jim. Just a few brief things about Jim, who really probably needs no introduction, but it really has been no ordinary year for you, Jim. It's been quite a distinctive year. There's a small merger of $32 billion company that was closed this year we may have read about, that now appears that the merged company has actually outperformed the street's expectations in its first quarter, so it's something, quite an accomplishment for Jim. On top of that, Jim co-chaired the Democratic National Convention in Charlotte. And for the company, its former executive just became the governor of the state. So this is really quite exceptional year for Jim and Duke Energy. As I mentioned, Jim's been the CEO for now going into 25 years. And why is it that Jim is able to stay in that role and be so trusted at the helm of these major corporations? I think it's because Jim brings an optimism to the job, but also a serious intellectual curiosity to the job, a willingness to buck conventional wisdom, to ask the hard questions, go out on a limb when he thinks it's necessary. Jim also keeps an open dialogue with everybody who cares about the energy business. When Jim came to Duke Energy, we convened in the first months here a roundtable of all the environmental community here, just so he could engage and understand the issues of the community. He understands the community serving, so all will trust him at the helm of those corporations. And he's brought some distinctive programs to North Carolina as well. I just want to call out a few. His efforts at Save a Watt and the ability to try and the effort to make energy efficiency work with the business model of a regulated utility, where it famously for years has not. And his efforts in Charlotte through Envision Charlotte and now launching a company called E4 to try and make Charlotte and the state a hub of energy activity for the world. Akin to Silicon Valley. But most of all, I think what Jim brings is Jim leads his company with an eye beyond just the next quarter, distinctively amongst his peers. Now, we just heard that last quarter went pretty well, so he looks at the quarters as well. but really with an eye towards the world that he's going to leave for his grandkids. And that is why, what makes him really unique amongst his peers, and perhaps unfortunately, and that is why it's a thrill to have him come here and talk to us about the future of energy and the world that energy will leave to his grandkids. Thank you, Jim.
Great introduction. Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Tim, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. You've raised the bar for me. Made it a little more difficult for me with that wonderful introduction, but thank you so much. I am really delighted to be here today and to talk about the power sector and the future of energy, not just in North Carolina, but in the United States and around the world. But I want to start our conversation today, because I look up at the clock, and it's 9:01. I'm going to do my best to talk for only 20 to 25 minutes. Then I want to open it up to questions. And because I think questions allow me to address what's on your mind, and more importantly, for us to have a rich conversation, one where I can learn from it, but it also allows me to address the issues that are important to you. Now, when we get to that part of the Q&A part, I want to challenge you to ask me the toughest, most provocative question you can ask me. And I'm going to grade you based on how tough it is. Plus, earlier this month, I talked to the Harvard Energy Club. I'm going to compare you to them. Okay? I'm going to find out who can ask me the toughest questions. Do they come from Cambridge? Do they come from Durham? So that'll be kind of an interesting session. But first, let me begin with some very important starting points. First, our company has a mission of providing affordable, reliable, increasingly clean electricity in safe and sustainable ways 24/7, 365 days a year. Pretty straightforward mission, but a tough mission. It's a tough mission because we have to do the trade-off between affordability, reliability, and clean. We try to work hard to not fall into the trap of either or, it's affordable or clean, but the way to do both. That's a very important way to think about it. So the trade-offs, the balancing, drives almost every energy and environmental issue we face. The second thing is that we have the good fortune of having a portfolio of ways to generate electricity, in stark contrast to the transport sector, which only is reliant today on oil, increasingly on hybrids, on electric cars, but really on oil. In our business, we have a number of ways to meet the demands of our customers. First, we can invest in energy efficiency. I believe the most energy efficient power plant we build is the one that we don't build. So investments in energy efficiency are very important. We can generate electricity and meet the demands with nuclear, with coal, with natural gas, and with renewables. Each plays a role. Each has a history. And quite frankly, the history of all those alternatives is a function of what part of the country you live in. If you live in an area that's rich in coal, you generally build coal plants, or gas, like Texas. Or in the Carolinas, 50% of our electricity comes from nuclear, because we led the country in the development of nuclear. And as a consequence of that, we're able to provide reliable electricity with a small carbon footprint on a relative basis. And because we did it early, our cost structure is very low and 20% lower than the national average. So this portfolio idea is very important. And a lot of the debate is, well, what do you build? And that is something that I think that we will talk about in our conversation today. So if you think about our mission, think about the portfolio, and also think about where we've been. And I think that is really important. Go back 100 years. 100 years ago, actually more like 120 years ago, is when Edison and companies were beginning to generate electricity. And the power plants were built in the cities. And there was competition. And if you saw pictures of cities, well, first of all, because they burned coal in fireplaces, because they burned wood, you could hardly see your hand in front of you in cities like Chicago and Detroit and Pittsburgh, just name the city. And then as they developed electricity, you saw the wires everywhere, because different companies were selling. On the same block, it might be 4 companies selling to. But then it evolved. And think about when we started down the road, because we used kerosene, we used coal in fireplaces and wood. Who could have imagined when we started down this road what electricity would enable as we march toward providing universal access to every home and every business in our country? Could you have imagined in 1900 that you would have enabled refrigeration, that you would have enabled X-rays, MRIs? Could you have imagined that you would have enabled computers, the internet? Other people invented it. Now, if you're supporters of Al Gore, you know he did. But the reality is, who could have imagined that we enabled radios and TVs in the modern world? We could never imagine that when we started down that road. And yet today, we're at a critical point because everyone has access in the US to electricity. In stark contrast to the world, there's 1.3 billion people who have no access to electricity, no access to the modern world. And that's an interesting conversation in itself, what the consequences of that are. But the other thing is, we're at a very critical point because we're starting through a transformation in our industry. And as we marched down the road, it became monopolies where we granted franchise to serve because they didn't want all the competition because it'd be more efficient to do that. We marched down the road where we had to, nuclear was the first real technological innovation. And then we marched further down the road and they said, well, let's try deregulation of generation. And today we sit in a hybrid world where 19 states have deregulated generation, transmission and distribution still regulated, and there were other states like North Carolina and South Carolina remain vertically integrated and regulated as they always have been during this period of time. But today we're at a different place. But all through this period, and certainly in my experience as CEO, I have always run the business recognizing that we should take a stakeholder approach. What does that mean? That means my assignment is to create value for our customers by providing electricity, to create value for the investors, whether you're debt or equity investors, to create value for the communities that we serve, to create value for our employees, to create value for the environment, to create value for all those who are all our vendors. So we have this incredible network, and oftentimes we try to create value for all, but sometimes we have to balance those. Again, back to what I said at the beginning with respect to the portfolio. This notion, a nuanced notion of trying to get the balance right, both in the service we provide, but also with respect to creating value for our stakeholders. And so these are kind of basic principles, and this is the history. But now we're at a different place. Think about where we are. Maybe it's better to go back to 2007. Think about what we imagined. We thought in 2007 that natural gas prices were $10 to $12 an MMBTU. We were on the edge of a nuclear renaissance in this country. We were also at a very interesting place in that we projected the growth in the demand of electricity to be 40% by 2030. And the economy was booming. I mean, that's not so many years ago. But a lot's changed since 2007. First, we've seen a deep economic recession. And the reality for our sector is the demand for electricity is fallen to such a level that we will not be back to the 2007 level until 2016 or 17. Almost a lost decade in the demand growth for our business. Now, for our environmentalists, that's a good thing, particularly with respect to the emissions of CO2. But the reality is we've lost a significant growth in the demand. The second thing is we've seen a decline in energy use. I mean, residential use, industrial use. It's bad news when you lose industrial, because that really means you're losing jobs and investments in the places that you serve. But we've seen an interesting dynamic on residential. We're seeing per residential usage actually decline during this period of time. In part because of more efficient appliances, in part because of more efficient homes, in part because of utility energy efficiency programs. All these things are really reducing per residential use. And that's a good thing for a wide variety of reasons. But at the same time, we have seen the rise of the digital grid. Now, I am very reluctant to use smart grid because smart grid is a concept that's been oversold, overhyped. And as A.C. Clarke says, all change is overestimated in the short term and underestimated in the long term. And I think that will be true as we move from an analog grid to a digital grid. And what it really means to me is two-way communication on our distribution network. Think about it. We do not know when a customer's out, they have to call us. We have an analog grid. But with a digital grid and with communication, we will know that. So our reliability, which is already 99.9%, will improve. Our ability to restore service will improve as a consequence of that. Also, the digital meter is going to lead to significant changes in our ability to help our consumers reduce their use of electricity. And I'll come back to that in a moment, because that's an important part of what the future looks like as we look to the future. So the smart grid has been part of it. Another part of the story is really shale gas. It is transformative, I think maybe more transformative than even nuclear was in the 60s and the 70s. I mean, think about our mix of use of electricity in 2007. About 19% gas, probably 50% coal, 20% nuclear, the remaining hydro and renewables. And what has happened in the last 5 years is so remarkable, tied to this shale gas revolution. As I said a moment ago, gas was 10 to 12 bucks an MMBTU. Today, I didn't check this morning, but it's about $3.75, and it was low as $1.82 earlier this year. That and the amount of gas available to us is dramatic compared to what we thought in 2007. In 2007, we were just finishing billion-dollar investments in LNG terminals to import natural gas because we were running out. Now people say we have so much, they're looking at making billion-dollar investments to export natural gas. I mean, what a turnaround in 5 years. And people think we're kind of a slow, sleepy industry. But that's a really dramatic change because we're a long cycle business. We build power plants for 40 years, 60 years. We have to deliver annually, but we have to look long term. But this shale gas thing is transformative. I look at our system. We used to dispatch hydro first, nuclear, then coal, because it's incremental dispatch, marginal cost. But today, we dispatch after nuclear our natural gas combined cycle plants. And that's a pretty dramatic change. The other thing that comes from the shale gas in the United States, remember I talked about 50% coal? This year, my prediction is it'll be about 30 to 35% coal, 30% to 35% natural gas. The greatest competition to coal in this country, a lot of people say it's EPA regulations. I say it's natural gas because it's cheaper and it's cleaner. And we have the combined cycle units to use it. And that's another thing that's happened. There's been significant changes in EPA regulations. And these regulations are on SOx, NOx, mercury, fine particulate. And it's going to require us to make investments to reduce these emissions. But we saw this coming. And our combined companies has had a $9 billion program where we built new plants. We built 10 new plants. All will be online by the end of this year, or one next year. And as a consequence of building those plants, we're going to shut down 90 old, high-emitting coal units throughout the areas that we serve in the Midwest and in the South. That's going to reduce our carbon emissions dramatically from about 150 to maybe 100 tons. Still a lot, by the way, 100 million tons. Sorry, left off a, I'm a lawyer by training, I don't do numbers. And so, in our emissions of SOx, NOx, and mercury, we're talking about reductions of 80 and 70 and 60% as a consequence of shutting down those old units and building new plants. 2 coal plants, one here, very controversial, Cliffside, but it's one of the cleanest coal plants in the country. Our coal gasification plant is the cleanest plant, not just in the United States, but around the world in terms of the use of coal. And the remainder of the plants we've built have been combined cycle plants. So this shale gas revolution has been transformative. And it's allowed us to comply. I mean, think about the balance I talked about at the beginning: affordable, reliable, clean, increasingly clean. Clearly, our emissions footprint is much improved, SOx, NOx, mercury, CO2. But it's more affordable because the gas prices are lower, cheaper than coal. That's why we're dispatching it before. But we saw that coming. That's why we built those plants. Now, we didn't imagine that shale gas would be as dramatic as it was. I mean, I kind of was reluctant to embrace shale gas because I remember being in Washington in 1978 when they passed the Fuel Use Act that outlawed the burning of natural gas for electricity because it was a premium fuel and we're running out of it in the United States. That law was repealed in '85. I've seen the volatility of natural gas. I got to a place, and I used to be in the gas pipeline business. I used to quote Benjamin Franklin. Remember what he said? He said, there are only 2 things in life that are certain: death, taxes, And I added to it the volatility of natural gas prices. Now, that still might be true, but I don't see it in the foreseeable future. So I see shale gas as something that's been transformative to our industry, transformative to our country, and is going to give us an opportunity to become a net exporter of BTUs. I just read the IEA report, and they basically predict by 2030 the US might be an exporter of oil. Imagine that. But I think we're going to be a net exporter of BTUs with coal, refined products, and even natural gas by the end of this decade. So that's a pretty different place for our country to find itself, kind of compared to where we thought we were in the 1970s, or where we thought we were just in 2007. The other thing that I would point out is this is a combination of the recession, but also shale gas and emphasis on energy efficiency and CAFE standards, that we're on track to achieve President Obama's objective to reduce CO2 17% below the 2005 level by the end of this decade. We're going to do that as a consequence of that combination of factors. And so as a country, our carbon footprint is coming down faster than anyone imagined, primarily as a result of it. And I'll give you one quick story, because I think it's an important story to tell. Shale gas is amazing to me on several levels. It's amazing because the majors aren't the ones that discovered it and developed it. Now, they're buying up all the companies because they got huge balance sheets and the ability to do the development in a responsible manner. But it was really developed by George Mitchell and a company called Mitchell Energy, which was subsequently bought by Devon. But what George Mitchell was determined to use horizontal drilling, which is an innovation that occurred in the 80s, use fracking, but fracking in a different formations. Fracking had been done for a long time, but not in that far below the earth and in these kinds of formations. And he worked on it. And everybody said, whoa, what great entrepreneurial capability. All done without the government. Not so fast. Because the typical seismic capability that we had didn't really identify these molecules of oil and gas, maybe a mile below the surface. They didn't identify it, but it was a technology the Department of Defense had developed to basically, during the Cold War, to hunt Russian submarines. And so Mitchell worked with the government to develop this technology and to use it to discover these formations deep below the surface. And it's that transition, it's interesting that not done by a major company, done by independents, done in cooperation with government technology. And that's a story about kind of the future of innovation in our industry. And I worry about that. I worry about it because we're a large company now. This combination with Progress has made us the largest utility in the US, second largest in the world. And because, in my mind, big and smart, big and agile don't go together. I think the key to success is having the capability to see the future, to act on it, to be agile, be smart, to look around the corner, and to make things happen and not be complacent. Because big companies tend to be complacent. So that's my number one fear. I'm proud to be the largest. I think it's a smart place for our customers because we'll have a lower cost of capital. But I fear that we won't adopt and innovate in the way we need to because innovation is coming, not just in the production of electricity, but innovation is coming in the use of electricity. Let me kind of step back and give you a vision. Every power plant that we own today is going to be retired and replaced by 2050. We have a virtual blank sheet of paper to redesign our generation fleet in a way that makes sense for the future. What a great opportunity. But what a short period of time we have to do it. But we also have a chance with our distribution and transmission, as I talked about earlier, to have a digital grid. What that's really going to lead to is incredible productivity gains in the use of electricity. I see home energy management systems. I see new technologies. You know, you already see a reduction in the residential use. I see significant reductions coming. Most people project that the growth in the demand for electricity is going to be 1%. In our IRP, our experts think it's 1%. You know what the great thing about being a CEO is? You don't have to agree with your experts. And I think that the demand for electricity may be flat or slightly declining in the future because of these productivity gains in the use of electricity. And I think that is a pretty interesting thought. It really challenges our business model. So what is our business model? Historically, it's built on building new plants to meet growing load. Now we're going to have to replace plants with more modern, more efficient, cleaner plants. But guess what? Our customers are going to have a hard time paying higher prices for these new plants as we retire fully depreciated plants. Because look up, look at the light. The light is going to be the same. This is not like going from an iPhone 4 to iPhone 5, where you can say, oh, look at these new, apps or new capabilities. Light's still the same. So one of our challenges is to help people understand that this basic good, and by the way, people in New Jersey and New York appreciate us now much more than anybody. And in fact, I'm very proud of our company. We sent 2,900 people there to help restore service, more than any company in the country. And our people are never happier or have higher morale when they are restoring service. People bring them coffee, they bring them, cupcakes, they bake food for them, and our people feel great about restoring service. I'm not proposing that we kind of turn the lights off for a couple of weeks so you'll appreciate us. But the fact of the matter is, what would you pay for electricity if you didn't have it? That's kind of an interesting way to think about it. What would the 1.3 billion people, if they had the capability, pay to have electricity? I guarantee you what they pay, and they pay a very high price in New York and New Jersey compared to here, they'd pay much more if they had it when they didn't have it. So our challenge is to change our business model. We need to move from the way we've been regulated for 100 years more toward a decoupling / formula rate approach. That makes more sense. Because if customers know we don't make money by selling more, then they will trust us to advise them in how to reduce their usage. So it puts us in a position of greater trust. Because we have the relationships with the customers, we have the lower cost of capital than all our customers, so we can help them invest. We can invest on their behalf in devices that reduce their use. We can develop the software and understand the algorithms of the use in the home and reduce significantly their usage, meeting their comfort and convenience criteria. We can do all that. That's the future that we're going to, where our role is not just selling kilowatt hours. Our role is the optimization of the use of electricity in homes, in businesses, in neighborhoods, across our systems, across regions. That is our future. Now, we're going to have to change some regulatory systems. We're going to have to adopt new technologies. We're going to have to use our balance sheet in ways we haven't in the past. We've got to be prepared to do that. And I'm excited about that world and our ability to produce significant gains, productivity gains in the use of electricity. We have the ability to do that with a new business model as we move through the 21st century. Okay, it's your turn. And as I like to say, bring it. Bring your best.
Coming down from 150 gigatons per year to 100 gigatons is commendable. Is that CO2 or is that carbon mass?
I think it's CO2.
Anyway, but it's not enough in terms of avoiding climate disaster if you look carefully at the work being done by Jim Hansen and others. Why not move more aggressively into deployment of solar and wind?
That's a good question. We are. We've invested over $3 billion in solar and wind. You don't see it here because we are developing it where the wind blows and the sun shines. We're basically developing it. We will have, by the end of this year, 2,000 megawatts, and 4 years ago we had nothing. We will have 2,000 megawatts of wind and solar that we're selling to utilities in about 15 states. And so that business we have developed, and actually we're making more money on selling wind and solar than we are on our regulated business here in North Carolina in terms of return on our investment. So we are investing in that business because we think it's important to have the capability to do that. But let me share with you kind of two important factoids. One factoid is, I'm also on the board of the Nature Conservancy, in part because I believe in the preservation of land. It's a principle for me. And I look at a nuclear plant, 1,000 megawatts I can build on 1/3 of a square mile. To get the equivalent amount of energy, I have to build solar on 40 square miles. And I have to build wind on 200 square miles. So that's why if you're serious about carbon, you got to be serious about nuclear. It's an energy density issue for the physicists in the crowd. But there's another conversation I want to share with you that kind of drives me in that direction. Because I've been an advocate for the regulation of CO2. It had made me popular. But the consequence of it is this. One Sunday morning, I had breakfast or brunch with Dr. James Lovelock. He wrote Gaia, Revenge of Gaia. He's 93 today, he's probably 89 at the time. Had a wonderful breakfast with him, trained as a medical doctor. But he has a view. He looks at climate change and the risk associated with that, compares it to the risk associated with nuclear, and it says it's easier to manage the risk of nuclear than the risk of climate change. And if you think about that, and he said to me then, and I think it's really sort of interesting seeing the future, he said, I'm worried about New York, I'm worried about London, because when the storms come and when the oceans rise, they're going to be most affected. They need to be planning on adaptation today. That's what he told me. And making investments in adaptation because it's too late in many ways. Not that we shouldn't work on mitigation, but we ought to have a huge focus on adaptation.
May I ask my question now? So I'm Marcia Walker with SAP, and I'm not worried about my grade because I graduated a long time ago up here.
Right there. Okay, sorry.
But we are in an institution of higher learning, and I loved what you said about the digitization of everything that you're doing and that your job is for optimization, because I absolutely see that as well, and thank you for not liking smart grid. I hate that term as well. But that comes with a very different skill set, being able to do that optimization and balance all of those different factors that you talked about. And what I find is that people people don't know what they don't know. So they take a statistics class in their freshman year and they think they're experts in predictive analytics and modeling. What is your company doing and what are your peers doing to develop the skill sets of the upcoming generation, and what types of different skill sets are you seeing as needed for success in the energy field?
That's a great question. I mean, let me just stay on that, because you've kind of opened the door to data and what I call big data. Historically, we only had 12 touches a year with a customer, 12 data points. And it ended up being kind of reading their meter. With a digital meter, you're going to really have, millions of data points with respect to their use during the course of a day. And so how to manage big data is going to be a huge challenge, and we don't have that skill set. Who does? I know. Well, there are companies. I have a niece, actually, that works for a company in Chicago that really is all about how do you ask the right questions with data and try to tease out insights. There's a company that I met with in Palo Alto that really does this for large banks and has a capability to detect fraud. And fraud is a hard thing to detect. But they've been able to take data, ask the right questions, manipulate that data to get the right outcome. So I think that's a skill set that we're really going to need. The notion of developing technologies, I'm a chief technology officer, and over the last 4 or 5 years has looked at over 700 technologies, and we have a funnel, and we're developing the technologies and doing pilots. And so that ability to pilot technologies to see how they can be improved. The meters we're deploying in Ohio, we helped design. We just didn't take it off the shelf from the company that provided it. We found a company that would work with us. The only thing we will change on that meter in the future is a communication device. As those communication capabilities change. So the skill sets are really skill sets around building a new fleet, skill sets around how to use data. I mean, we don't have the capability yet to write the software and have an understanding of the algorithms of use within a home. Did an experiment in Charlotte, 100 homes. We reduced their peak usage 20%, and they saw no change in the quality of service. But we put sensing devices, and to give you an example of how it works, when someone would turn on the dishwasher and send a signal to the refrigerator, it would cycle down, but it wouldn't come on until it cycled down enough. Dishwasher would kick in, and then when it completed its work, it would send a signal back to the refrigerator, and then it would cycle back up. So we reduced their peak usage 20% and saw no change in quality of service. So it's understanding how to use that data and how to use these new technologies to help search the technologies. Those are skill sets we're going to need to really succeed in the future.
Hello, Mr. Rogers.
Yes.
My name is Mark Carigliano. I'm a professor of alternative energy at the Keynote Flagler Business School. And I teach my students on climate change, and I know you've been active in crafting policy on climate change. And one of the big challenges is using a cost-benefit analysis in order to determine how much investment should be done today to combat climate change in the future. And with such a long-term vision, the big question is, what's the appropriate discount rate to use to discount future harm to today? So my big question is, what is the appropriate discount rate to take our future harm to today?
You're moving to the head of the class in terms of hard questions. I think the way I would answer the question, I can't tell you exactly the right discount rate, but I can tell you the right way to think about it. We need, in cost benefit, we need to use a life cycle approach. For instance, if you're burning coal and it translates into mountaintop mining, where you buy your coal from, and I'm against mountaintop mining. I mean, I grew up in Kentucky, I understand that, and the damage that's done. So you have to factor in all the whole life cycle implications of every source that you use. And I think that is kind of a change in the way we've historically looked at cost benefit. And so I wish I could give you a number But I think it has to be thought of in life cycle terms. That's a better way to think through as you compare different alternatives. One way back.
Hi, Mr. Rogers.
Yeah.
My name is Caroline Hansley, and I'm a junior at NC State, and I'm part of the UNC school system. And the UNC school system pays Duke Energy $200 million each year, around that, for our energy usage.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the energy. So part of that is a problem because we're really concerned that our energy is fueling dirty energy sources, causing things like Sandy to happen and increasing climate change, which you talked about is happening right now. And actually 10 of the 16 schools have climate commitments to be carbon neutral by 2050. Yet your 20-year plan projects only 3% renewable energy by 2030. So those things don't really match up. And my question to you is, what is your plan to help the UNC school system hit our climate neutrality commitments and increase more renewable energy?
Well, I think the first answer is always an investment in energy efficiency. That often is the cheapest way to reduce carbon footprint. Then you really have, I mean, if you're in North Carolina, you're in a better starting place than if you're in Ohio or Indiana, because 50% of your electricity comes from nuclear, which has zero carbon footprint. So that's a start. But as we are now burning gas, as I said, the electricity you get from us, that carbon footprint is coming down. And it will come down further as we retire our plants over the years. So we're on a trajectory of reducing it. But I think your first thing to do is to look around the university system and look at ways. I will say a competitive school in the ACC came to us and said, can we buy all nuclear? Because we want to win the contest, because then we'll have zero carbon. And I had our people look into it, because it kind of sounded like a clever idea. And we couldn't find a way to structure our tariffs to really allow that to happen. But I do think you're thinking about it right. Renewables are part of the answer, but they're not a complete answer. A key part of what's undermined renewables is low gas cost. Because people say, well, if you have to build gas to back up renewables, because it doesn't, you only get electricity when the sun shines or when the wind blows, and the battery technology is not there yet, but it will be there, it's coming. Although I'm reminded of what Thomas Edison said in 1890. He said that battery technology will transform our industry and its development is just around the corner. It's just been a long corner. But I think the important point here is all these things need to fit in. But as I said a moment ago, start first with energy efficiency.
Mr. Rogers?
Good.
Sorry.
Yes, sir, I see you.
Oh, thank you. Good morning. My question, you just mentioned energy efficiency. Could you just provide your thoughts and insights as to how power and utility companies are able to attract capital from investors and also provide an appropriate return, given the fact that those investments could be potentially going to energy efficiency or energy conservation, which has sort of a competing priority as it relates to revenue generation or cash flows. So, just curious to know how companies are able to attract that type of capital. Is it sustainable, and is it different from a regulatory environment versus non-regulated environment? Any kind of thoughts you can give on that would be appreciated.
First of all, I'd redefine our business model to give us the same incentives to invest in energy efficiency as we do in generation. So if I put $1 billion in energy efficiency, I make as much off that as if I put $1 billion in a nuclear plant. So that's an important change in the regulatory environment. The other important change is really to formula rates, which puts me in a better position to really promote energy efficiency within the home. I envision doing this within the regulated utility. Yeah, you can do it outside the utility, but I think it's better done within. And when we did solar in the rooftop in North Carolina, it was very popular, but the Consumer Council blocked us. We wanted to do a $100 million investment or 20 megawatts, and they limited us to only 10 megawatts because they thought it would drive our price up too much. So it's really about changing the mentality of the regulators and the consumer councils. It all goes back to this balancing affordability and increasingly clean. But I think at the end of the day, if we get the regulatory environment right in this state, you'll see more investment in energy efficiency, and we'll still be a strong, growing utility, because here's the reality. As I said earlier, we got to retire and replace every power plant we operate, and that's going to drive rates up, and that's where the cash is going to come from, not from the growth in demand.
Mr. Rogers, I'm actually a ringer in that I used to work for the company, so you should know that in all fairness.
Okay.
But one of the questions I had was about energy.
Did you have a good experience?
I had a great experience. I know Lee over there.
I was just getting ready for your question.
The answer you expected, right? My question is about energy efficiency. Now, I was with the company, and this is not unlike many utilities. Energy efficiency sometimes is seen as revenue erosion, time of use meters, et cetera. And I realized that you mentioned innovation and a business model that's different. I noticed that Lee's here, who kind of shoulders that innovation responsibility for you. But I'm concerned about tariff structure. Once you've installed smart meters, and so you've gotten rid of one customer complaint-driven issue, you still have things like street lights and such, which are still simple. You're long on generation, especially at night, but yet when the street light goes out, it's very visible. It creates a lot of customer calls and requests, and that's also moving to digital means, LED lights and such. So there's the innovation, but there's also the long regulatory and tariff building process. Many cities are looking at LED lights or networked LED lights, and yet to get a tariff from the utility, it seems that the utility is a bit disincented to do so, because generation is ample at night, and the savings are fairly small, but the savings are important to cities that are struggling for cash. So it's a struggle between innovation and how do you speed up the tariff creation process so that you incent yourself and the cities to invest in LED technology, or especially networked LED technology. So now you know when the light's out before someone has to call and tell you the light's out.
That's a really good question, and it really goes to the heart of how we have to transform our business, how we have to transform the regulatory regime. We have to take a long view. We can't have a short-term view, oh my goodness, we can't do that, that's going to reduce the demand. And if that reduces demand, that is bad. And I think built into our culture has been a little bit of that. Because we always knew that the greater the demand, the more power plants we built, the more money we made. Good thing. And the greater the demand, the more units you have to spread your fixed cost over so you keep your costs down. I think one of the things you have to come to grips with is that the real price of electricity has been flat for 50 years in the United States. Real price. But the real price of electricity is going to rise dramatically as we modernize our generation, transmission, and distribution. When I talk about productivity gains in the use of electricity, like LED lighting for cities, we need to take this long-term view and help them reduce demand, because I know their prices are going to go up. And so people are going to be unhappy when prices go up, and they go to any public hearing and it's clear. But the reality is we're cleaning up our system, reducing the emissions, but we need to change our thinking and embrace these ideas. But then we have to go hand in hand to the regulator to convince them to change their ideas about how we do business, because they are a product of the past as we are. So we have to change, they have to change, and by us all changing and embracing this future, our customers will be better off, and the communities we live in will be more sustainable. over the long term. So that's the kind of thinking that has to be embedded, not just in the mentality of the people within our company, but also in the legislature, at the regulatory commission, and at the public commission, at the public staff.
Mr. Rogers, thank you for coming today. My name is Richard Bethune. I'm a first year here at Fuqua. Shale gas looks very attractive right now, but will utilities become over-reliant on it? And if you believe they will, how can they avoid this predicament? Thank you.
No, that is also a very good question. It's a good question because it's going to be the temptation of regulators and others to build all gas all the time. And that undermines what I said at the very beginning, this portfolio approach. Because who would have predicted, just the history of gas, where it was unlawful to burn gas for a period of time, and the great volatility in the price of gas over time. Who would predict it to be so cheap and maybe so available for so long? So thank goodness we kept that option alive. But in the same way, we need to keep the coal option alive, advancing technology like our coal gasification up in the Midwest. We need to keep nuclear and small modular reactors and the research and development on small modular reactors. I just noticed the other day where B&W got a grant to really push that further. We have to keep all of these options alive because I don't want to get overly dependent on any single way of generating electricity. That would be bad. This all gas all the time could undermine the viability of our ability, or undermine our ability to achieve affordable, reliable, and increasingly clean electricity over time. So again, in life, it's not one or the other. It's kind of a balance of all. And that's why I'm reluctant to take anything out of the portfolio. But that's going to be hard to do because people are going to push build gas, build gas. And the interesting thing is happening in the markets that have been deregulated is that, because we're in that market, coal plants aren't running, so they're getting shut down. You just read the other day where a nuclear plant in Wisconsin is being shut down. Because, I'm on the board of IMPO, and I know what it takes to run a nuclear plant. As the fleet ages, you have to put more O&M into the plants. You have to put more capital into plants. You have to do more modifications. But if you're in a competitive market where gas is $3.75, that's why you see the margin is really squeezed on nuclear plants in competitive markets. And if they go offline, nuclear in the United States, it represents 70% of the carbon-free electricity in this country. And so we need to make a transition there. But your question is good, and it's a challenge that we have, because people tend to fall in love with the flavor of the day. And that tends to be the flavor of today.
We have time for one more question. Go ahead.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Mohammed bin Yahya. I'm a first-year student here at Duke University. I'm going to follow up on the gas issue. As we know, and as you mentioned, there is a huge reserve of gas, and there is a big debate whether or not to export this gas in the short term. On one side, the oil and gas companies want to export this gas to be able to invest and to finance their growth. And on the other side, the industry want to take advantage of cheap gas to build a competitive advantage and to be more profitable. So what do you think is best for the U.S. economy in this gas issue? Thank you.
First of all, that question is above my pay grade. But I'll try to share how I would think through it. Dow Chemical made a decision to build a chemical facility in Louisiana because of the availability of low-cost gas. They would have built that outside the United States, but for the fact that we have shale gas today. And that investment creates jobs, which is good for our economy. If we start, and it's going to be a great temptation for companies to sell gas that's selling here at $3.75, Because if you go to Europe, you can sell LNG at 10 to 12 bucks. If you go to Asia, it's somewhere between 13 to 15 bucks an MMBTU. So they're going to want to sink $1 billion into the liquefaction of gas and export it into those markets. I mean, the ARB on that is huge. And so the public policy question really is, how much should we export? And shouldn't we keep that? Because I view gas as a great bridge fuel to technologies we've yet to develop, like small modular reactors and other technologies. And so I think it's a tough trade-off. I think it makes sense to allow some export. The tougher question is how much? Because if it translates into driving the price back to $12, I mean, that all the gas all the time scenario, we're screwed. Because those that are heavily dependent on gas and it's $12 an MMBTU, that's a bad day for those customers. So I think it's a little bit of protect it, keep it for ourselves, allow a little export, but not too much. Because as more and more companies get dependent on it, as companies like Dow make decisions, and it creates jobs here, we need to be mindful of job creation in the US. And the lower the cost of our energy infrastructure, the better our ability to attract investment and create jobs in energy-intensive industries. Well, thank y'all very much. Y'all have asked some very good questions. You know, Tim is looking at me. He says, Harvard, Duke, how would I do it? I will tell you this. The presentation I made at Harvard, and this is the second time I've talked to the energy group there, and it's in Spangler Hall. I don't know if many of you know who Dick Spangler is. He used to run the UNC university system here in North Carolina. He lives right around the corner from me in Charlotte. But he endowed and built that building. And so when I spoke, I said, it's really great to be here at UNC at Harvard. You know, you're laughing, they didn't. So I think the questions have been terrific both places, and I really appreciate the questions. They were very good, very thoughtful, fun being with y'all. Thanks.
As a small token of our appreciation for coming to speak, we have a small gift for you. Thank you very much. All right. So we're going to do a 10-minute break before our next panel starts. I believe the coffee has been refilled, so you can go and grab a cup of coffee if you want. And please join again at about 10:05. Thank you.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.